The silence in the cottage was a physical presence. It was a silence woven from 50 years of shared whispers, sudden laughter, and the comfortable quiet of two people who knew each other's thoughts without needing to speak. Now, it was just silence. Jacob, 75 years old and a widower for 1 week, sat in the armchair that still bore the faint, familiar indentation of his wife, Evelyn. He stared out the window at the lake, its surface a sheet of hammered silver under the pale afternoon sun. The cottage was not a house, it was an archive. Every floorboard, every pane of glass, every crooked nail held a story. He had hammered most of them himself. He and Evelyn had built this place with their own hands, a testament to a love that was as sturdy and enduring as the old pine trees that surrounded them. It was here they had raised their son. Here they had grown old together, and here, in the small bedroom overlooking the lake, that he had held Evelyn's hand as she took her final, peaceful breath. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway shattered the quiet. Jacob didn't need to look. He knew the sound of his son's expensive German sedan. A moment later, Mark appeared in the doorway, not with the gentle deference of a grieving son, but with the brisk, impatient energy of a man on a tight schedule. Mark was 45, a man sculpted by the city. He wore a tailored suit that looked out of place in the rustic cottage, and his face was etched with the permanent, low-grade tension of a life measured in stock prices and quarterly reports. He did not hug his father. He placed a sleek leather briefcase on the kitchen table and surveyed the room with a critical, appraising eye. "Dad," he began, his voice devoid of the warmth it had once held, "we need to talk. We need to be practical." Jacob turned his head slowly from the window. "Practical? Evelyn was buried a week ago, Mark. What is there to be practical about?" "About this," Mark said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the hand-stitched quilts, the stone fireplace, the 50 years of accumulated love. "This place. You can't stay here alone. It's not feasible." The words were like stones dropped into the quiet pool of Jacob's grief. "Not stay here? Mark, this is my home." "It was your home," Mark corrected him, his tone sharp. "It was our home. Now it's a 2-hour drive from the city. It's a lot of upkeep, and it's a safety risk for a man your age. The winters here are brutal. What if you fell? What if the power went out? No one would know for days." Every word was logical. Every word was sensible. And every word was utterly devoid of heart. Mark was not speaking as a son. He was speaking as a risk manager assessing a problematic asset. "I've been managing for 50 years, Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. "I think I can manage a few more." "That was with Mom here," Mark countered, his patience already wearing thin. "She was the one who ran this place. Let's be honest, Dad. You wouldn't know where to start." The condescension in his son's voice was a small, sharp blade twisting in an open wound. Jacob looked at the man his son had become, this stranger in a tailored suit who saw his father's life's work as a logistical problem. "So, what do you suggest?" Jacob asked, his voice flat. "We sell it," Mark said, the words quick and clean, like a surgeon's incision. "The market for lakefront property is at an all-time high. We could get a fantastic price for it. You could use the money to move into a nice, comfortable condo in the city. Closer to us. Closer to doctors. It's a smart thing to do." Jacob stared at his son, a chasm of understanding opening between them. For Mark, the cottage was an investment, a line item on a balance sheet. Its value was measured in square footage and market trends. For Jacob, its value was immeasurable. It was the feel of the sun-warmed floorboards under his bare feet. It was the memory of Evelyn's laughter echoing from the kitchen. It was the notch on the door frame where they had marked Mark's height as a boy. "No," Jacob said, the word a quiet, unshakable anchor in the shifting tide of his son's logic. "I'm not selling." Mark's face hardened. The facade of filial concern dissolved, revealing the cold, hard bedrock of his impatience. "Dad, don't be stubborn. This isn't a negotiation, this is a reality. I'm not going to spend my weekends driving back and forth to check on you. I have a life. I have a career. And I have a home," Jacob replied, his gaze returning to the lake. "You have a deteriorating asset that is becoming a liability," Mark snapped. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I've already spoken to a realtor. She's drawn up the papers. All you have to do is sign." The premeditation of it all, the cold, clinical efficiency, struck Jacob with the force of a physical blow. Mark hadn't come here to grieve with his father. He had come to close a deal. "I said no, Mark." This time, Mark's voice dropped, becoming low and menacing. "Dad, listen to me very carefully. You're going to sign these papers. If you don't, I will have no choice but to talk to my lawyer. We can file a petition. We can argue that you're not capable of making sound decisions for yourself anymore. Your grief, your age, a judge would see it our way. Do you really want a court to decide what's best for you? Do you want a stranger managing your life?" It was an ultimatum, delivered with the ruthless precision of a corporate takeover. The threat hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. He was using Jacob's grief as a weapon against him, painting his love for his home as a symptom of senility. Jacob looked at his son, at the hard set of his jaw, the cold ambition in his eyes. He saw a stranger, a man so disconnected from his own past that he was willing to burn it to the ground for a profit. In that moment, Jacob felt something shift inside him. The profound, overwhelming grief for his wife was still there, but it was now joined by a new, colder emotion, a deep and abiding disappointment in the son he had raised. He was tired. He was heartbroken. He did not have the strength for a legal battle, for the humiliation of having his competence questioned in a courtroom by his own child. He looked down at the papers on the table, at the neat black lines waiting for his signature. He thought of Evelyn. What would she have done? She would have fought, he knew. She would have fought with the quiet, unyielding strength that had been her hallmark. But he was not Evelyn. He was just a tired old man whose heart had been broken one too many times. With a hand that felt as heavy as stone, he reached for the pen. He did not look at his son. He could not bear to see the look of triumph he knew would be on his face. "All right, Mark," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You win. I'll sign." He signed his name, the familiar loops and swirls of his signature looking like a foreign script. With that single stroke of the pen, he had signed away 50 years of his life. He had signed away his home. He had signed away the last tangible piece of his life with the only woman he had ever loved. And as he pushed the papers back across the table, he felt a profound, chilling sense of loss. He had not just lost his wife, he had lost his son, too. Mark left as quickly as he had arrived. He gathered the signed papers, his movements brisk and efficient, his relief palpable. He did not offer a comforting word or a gentle touch. He simply said, "The realtor will call you in a few days to arrange a time to take photos. You'll have a month to clear out your personal things. A month. 30 days to dismantle a lifetime." The sound of Mark's car fading down the gravel road was replaced by a silence that was deeper and more profound than before. It was the silence of absolute finality. Jacob was now a tenant in his own home, a temporary custodian of his own memories, living on borrowed time. He didn't move from the kitchen table for a long time. He just sat there, staring at the empty space where the legal documents had been. The house, which had always been his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Every object, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards seemed to whisper the same word: goodbye. Over the next few days, he became a ghost in his own life. He wandered from room to room, his hand trailing along the familiar surfaces, trying to absorb the essence of the place before it was gone forever. He ran his fingers over the rough-hewn mantelpiece he had built from a fallen oak tree, remembering the pride he had felt, the way Evelyn had praised his handiwork. He stood in the kitchen, remembering the scent of her bacon, the sound of her humming as she kneaded dough on the old wooden countertop, a surface now worn smooth with 50 years of love and labor. He saw her everywhere. He saw her in the faded chintz armchair by the fireplace, the one she always sat in to read, a cup of tea steaming at her side. He saw her in the garden, her hands covered in soil, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed straw hat, her smile as bright as the sunflowers she so carefully tended. He saw her on the small wooden dock by the lake, her feet dangling in the cool water, her laughter echoing across the still surface. The house was not just a collection of rooms. It was a vessel, filled to the brim with the shared experiences that had constituted their life together. It held the memory of their first night here, as a young, hopeful couple, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, dreaming of the future they would build. It held the echoes of their son's childhood, the sound of his small feet running down the hallway, the memory of his excited shouts as he caught his first fish off the dock. And it was this memory of Mark, the boy, that now caused Jacob the most pain. He tried to reconcile the bright, curious child he had raised with the cold, pragmatic man who had just forced him to sell his home. Where had that boy gone? He remembered Mark's early years at the cottage. He had loved it then. He had loved the freedom of the woods, the thrill of swimming in the lake, the adventure of a campfire under the stars. Jacob had taught him how to skip stones, how to identify bird calls, how to build a proper fire. Those had been good years, years of simple, uncomplicated joy. The change had come later, during his teenage years. The cottage had become boring. His city friends, with their fast cars and their fashionable clothes, had no interest in fishing or hiking. The quiet beauty of the lake could not compete with the loud, glittering allure of the city. Mark began to see the cottage not as a haven, but as a prison, a symbol of the simple, working-class life he was so desperate to escape. His visits became shorter, more perfunctory. He would spend most of his time on his phone, his face illuminated by the cold, blue light of the screen, his presence in the room a form of absence. He would look at his father's calloused hands, at his mother's simple, homemade meals, with a kind of weary, affectionate pity that was more insulting than outright scorn. He had never understood their love for this place. He had never understood the deep, quiet satisfaction they found in a well-tended garden, in a freshly baked loaf of bread, in the simple act of watching the sunset over the lake. He saw their life as small, limited, a failure of ambition. He could not comprehend that for them it was the very definition of success. Now, as Jacob walked through the silent rooms, he understood the true nature of his son's ultimatum. Mark didn't just want to sell a piece of property. He wanted to erase a history that made him uncomfortable. He wanted to liquidate a past that didn't align with the sophisticated, successful image he had so carefully constructed for himself. He wanted to sever his ties to the simple, hard-working man who had given him everything, because that man was a reminder of a world he had long since left behind. Jacob stood in the doorway of Mark's old bedroom. The faded posters of rock bands were still on the walls. A small wooden boat he had carved for his son one long-ago summer still sat on the windowsill. He picked it up, its familiar weight a painful reminder of a love that had been lost, or perhaps had never been truly understood. He realized, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating, that he was not just grieving for his wife. He was grieving for his son. He was grieving for the boy who had gotten lost somewhere on the road to becoming a man. He put the small boat back on the windowsill. He would have to pack it, along with everything else. He would have to reduce 50 years of a shared life to a collection of cardboard boxes. But as he stood there, a new, cold thought began to form in his mind. What if he didn't? What if he refused to participate in this desecration? Mark wanted to sell the house, but the memories, the love, the very soul of the place, those were not for sale. They belonged to him and Evelyn, and he would be damned if he would let his son put a price tag on them. The month Mark had allotted him began to tick by, each day a small, painful death. The task ahead seemed monumental, impossible. How do you pack a life? How do you sort 50 years of shared existence into neat, labeled boxes? Jacob started in the attic, a dusty, dimly lit space that served as the cottage's unconscious mind. It was filled with the forgotten artifacts of their life together. Stacks of old National Geographic magazines, a box of Mark's childhood toys, Evelyn's old sewing machine, a collection of mismatched suitcases from trips they had never taken. He opened a trunk and was immediately enveloped in the faint, familiar scent of cedar and lavender. Inside were Evelyn's wedding dress, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, and his own old army uniform. He lifted the dress, the delicate lace as fragile as a memory. He remembered the day she had worn it, her face radiant, her eyes full of a fierce, hopeful love that had never wavered. He folded it carefully and placed it back in the trunk. These were not things that could be packed. They were relics. The process was slow, agonizing. Every object he touched was a portal to the past. A chipped teacup brought back the memory of a winter morning, the two of them huddled by the fire, warming their hands. A faded postcard from a friend recalled a long-ago summer. A child's drawing, signed with Mark's clumsy 7-year-old scrawl, was a painful reminder of the boy who had been lost. He found he couldn't do it. He couldn't sort, couldn't label, couldn't discard. He couldn't reduce the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful tapestry of his life with Evelyn to a collection of manageable, transportable items. To do so felt like a betrayal, a final, posthumous violation of the life they had built. Mark arrived the following weekend, as promised, to help. He strode into the cottage with an armful of cardboard boxes and a roll of packing tape, his energy a jarring intrusion into the house's quiet grief. "All right, Dad, let's get this done," he said, his tone brisk and businesslike. "We need to be efficient. We'll start with the kitchen. Keep, toss, donate. Simple." But it wasn't simple. For Mark, a set of mismatched plates was junk. For Jacob, it was the memory of a dozen different dinner parties, of friends and family gathered around their table. For Mark, a collection of old, worn cookbooks was clutter. For Jacob, it was the archive of Evelyn's culinary love, her handwritten notes in the margins, a conversation that continued even after her death. The weekend was a slow, agonizing battle of wills. Mark, armed with black trash bags, moved through the house like a conquering general, his pragmatism a weapon against his father's sentimentality. "Dad, you don't need this," he would say, holding up a worn, comfortable cardigan of Evelyn's. "It's old, it's frayed." "Your mother loved that sweater," Jacob would reply, his voice quiet but firm, as he took it from his son's hand and folded it gently. "This old radio, it doesn't even work. It was the first thing we bought for this house. We listened to the moon landing on it." Mark would sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated frustration. "Dad, you can't keep everything. You're moving into a one-bedroom apartment, not a museum. You have to be realistic." It was during this painful, invasive process that Jacob's resolve hardened. He watched his son, this stranger who moved through his sacred spaces with such casual, unthinking cruelty, and he knew he could not let this happen. He could not let Mark or the anonymous future buyers pick over the bones of his life. He could not let them turn his and Evelyn's sanctuary into a soulless, marketable property. The focal point of this struggle became the photo album. It was a large, heavy book, its leather cover worn soft with age and countless viewings. It was their most sacred text, the chronicle of their life together, meticulously assembled by Evelyn over 5 decades. It began with their own sepia-toned baby pictures, moved through their awkward teenage years, their black and white wedding photos, the vibrant, color-saturated images of Mark's childhood, and ended with a recent, poignant snapshot of Jacob and Evelyn, older now, their faces lined with love and time, standing in their garden, her head resting on his shoulder. Jacob had hidden it. Before Mark arrived, he had tucked it away in the back of his closet beneath a stack of old blankets. He knew, with an absolute certainty, that Mark would see it as just another piece of clutter, another old thing to be dealt with. On Sunday evening, as Mark was preparing to leave, his frustration at his father's uncooperative sentimentality at its peak, the idea that had been slowly germinating in Jacob's mind finally took root. It was a terrible, beautiful, and radical idea. He looked at his son, at the man who was so eager to erase his own history, and he understood what he had to do. Mark wanted the asset. He wanted the market value. He wanted to turn 50 years of love into a number on a bank statement. Fine, Jacob thought. He can have the land. He can have the insurance money. But he will not have the house. He will not have the memories. He will not have the soul of this place. That belonged to him and Evelyn, and he would be the one to decide its fate. As he watched Mark's car disappear down the road, a strange sense of calm settled over him. He was no longer a victim, a passive participant in the dismantling of his own life. He was now an agent, a man with a plan. He would not let his home be sold. He would set it free. He would perform one final, desperate, and loving act of preservation. He would turn his house of memories into a pyre, a monument of ash and smoke, ensuring that its spirit, its essence, would remain forever untouchable. A secret kept between him, his wife, and the quiet, watchful lake. The final week was a period of strange, quiet clarity for Jacob. The realtor had called, a cheerful, professional woman whose voice grated on his raw nerves. She had scheduled the photographer for the following Monday. That gave him a deadline, a final, non-negotiable endpoint to his life in the cottage. He spent the days engaged in a series of quiet, personal rituals. This was not about packing or sorting anymore. It was about saying goodbye. He walked the perimeter of the property each morning, his hand trailing along the familiar rough bark of the pine trees. He paused at the small vegetable patch, now fallow and waiting for a spring that would never come for him. He remembered Evelyn, on her knees in the dirt, her face smudged, her smile radiant as she held up a newly pulled carrot. He whispered her name to the wind, a quiet conversation with a ghost only he could see. He went down to the dock and sat for hours, watching the light change on the surface of the lake. He remembered teaching Mark to fish from this very spot, the boy's small hands struggling with the reel, his squeal of delight when he caught his first tiny perch. He felt a pang of sorrow, not for the man Mark had become, but for the boy he had lost. He did not feel anger anymore. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard, and strangely peaceful resolve. He was not acting out of spite. He was acting out of love, a fierce, protective love for the sanctity of the life he and Evelyn had built. He was a guardian performing his last, most sacred duty. On the final night, a Sunday, he began his preparations. The air was still and cold, the sky a starless, inky black. The world seemed to be holding its breath. He started by preparing a final meal. He didn't cook anything elaborate. He made the simple meal they had eaten on their very first night in the unfinished cottage 50 years ago. Grilled cheese sandwiches on thick, crusty bread, and a bowl of tomato soup from a can. He ate slowly at the small kitchen table, the silence of the house a comforting companion. He raised his water glass in a silent toast to the empty chair opposite him. "To us, my love," he whispered. After he had washed and dried the single plate, bowl, and spoon, he began to assemble his relics. He went to his closet and retrieved the old metal toolbox where he had decided to store his most precious items. It was heavy, solid, and fire-resistant. First, he placed the things he had saved for himself. His father's old pocket watch, its silver case worn smooth with time. The small, velvet box containing Evelyn's wedding ring, which he had slipped from her finger just before they closed the casket, and a small, framed photograph of her, taken on their 25th anniversary, her eyes sparkling with a love that time had only deepened. Then he went to the hiding place in the back of the closet and retrieved the large, leather-bound photo album. He held it for a moment, its weight familiar and comforting. This was the heart of the house, the physical manifestation of their shared history. He ran his hand over the worn cover, then carefully placed it inside the metal box on top of a folded wool blanket for protection. He closed the lid of the toolbox and locked it with a small, sturdy padlock. This was his ark, the vessel that would carry the essential truth of his life through the coming flood of fire. Finally, he began the last, terrible part of his ritual. He went to the small shed behind the cottage where he kept his tools and gardening supplies. From a high shelf, he took down a red metal can filled with kerosene for the old storm lantern. He carried it back into the house, its weight a heavy, sloshing burden. He did not rush. His movements were calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. This was not an act of madness or despair. It was a carefully planned, deeply meaningful act of consecration. He started in the living room. He poured a small amount of kerosene onto the pile of old newspapers and kindling he had laid in the stone fireplace. He splashed a little onto the faded floral curtains that Evelyn had sewn by hand, the ones that had framed their view of the lake for so many years. He moved into the bedroom and sprinkled a few drops on the old, handmade quilt that covered their bed. He did not douse the house. He was not trying to create an inferno. He was a practical man, a man who understood how things worked. He was simply creating the conditions for a plausible accident, an old, faulty flue, a stray spark, a tragic but entirely believable fire in a remote wooden cottage occupied by a grieving and perhaps forgetful old man. When he was finished, he stood in the center of the living room, the empty kerosene can in his hand. The house was quiet, waiting. He could almost feel Evelyn's presence beside him, her hand in his, her quiet strength supporting him. He was not destroying their home. He was liberating it. He was transforming it from a marketable asset into a sacred, untouchable memory. He took a single wooden match from the box on the mantelpiece. He looked around the room one last time, his gaze lingering on the armchair where she had read, the small table where they had played cards, the faint, worn path in the carpet between the kitchen and the living room, a path created by 50 years of shared steps. "I'm sorry, my love," he whispered to the silent, waiting house, "but I cannot let them sell your soul." He struck the match. The small flame flared to life, a tiny, defiant star in the darkness. He held it for a moment, then gently tossed it into the waiting fireplace. The match arced through the still air of the living room, a tiny, fleeting comet of light, and landed in the heart of the fireplace. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small, hungry tongue of flame licked at the edge of a kerosene-soaked newspaper. It hesitated, then flared, a sudden, eager bloom of orange and yellow. The fire caught quickly. It devoured the newspapers with a greedy, crackling roar, then leapt to the dry kindling. The sound filled the silent house, a living, breathing presence where there had only been ghosts. The flames climbed the pile of logs, their light dancing wildly across the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in a final, frantic dance. Jacob did not move. He stood in the center of the room, a silent, solitary witness to the beginning of the end. He felt the heat on his face, a dry, intense warmth that was a world away from the gentle comfort and heat of a normal hearth fire. This was a different kind of fire. It was not for warmth. It was for purification. A stray spark, larger than the others, leaped from the fireplace and landed on the old, worn rug at its base. The rug, a gift from Evelyn's mother, smoldered for a second, then caught, a small, dark circle of flame that began to spread, slowly at first, then with a terrifying speed. The fire reached the curtains. The faded floral fabric, which had absorbed the kerosene like a sponge, erupted in a sudden, violent whoosh of flame. The curtains became two pillars of fire climbing toward the low wooden ceiling, their light illuminating the room with a brilliant, terrible beauty. This was his cue. His carefully planned accident was now believably underway. He turned, his movements still calm and unhurried, and picked up the heavy metal toolbox from beside the door. He did not look back at the growing inferno. He had already said his goodbyes. He walked out of the cottage, closing the door softly behind him. He did not run. He walked with the steady, measured pace of a man completing a necessary, if painful, task. He followed the familiar, worn path that led down to the lake. The path his and Evelyn's feet had carved into the earth over 5 decades. The air outside was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the growing heat at his back. He could hear the fire now, a low, hungry roar that was growing in intensity. He could hear the sound of glass shattering as the windows of the living room succumbed to the heat. He reached the small wooden bench at the edge of the lake, the one he had built for Evelyn on their 10th anniversary. He sat down, placing the metal box carefully on the ground beside him. From this vantage point, he had a perfect, unobstructed view of the cottage. It was no longer a house, it was a pyre. Flames were now pouring from the living room windows, licking at the old wooden eaves. The roof, dried by the summer sun, began to smoke. He watched as the fire spread, moving with a relentless, unstoppable force. It moved into the kitchen, the place of so much warmth and nourishment. It climbed the stairs to the bedrooms, the places of rest and intimacy. He felt a profound, aching sadness, but no regret. He was watching the destruction of his past, but he was also witnessing its transfiguration. The house was being consumed, its physical form dissolving into smoke and ash. But its essence, its soul, was being released, transformed into something pure, intangible, and forever out of the reach of realtors and balance sheets. He thought of Mark. He imagined his son's face when he saw this, the shock, the fury, the raw, unadulterated rage at the loss of his precious asset. Mark would see only the loss of money. He would never understand that this was not an act of destruction, but an act of love, a final, desperate act of protecting something sacred from a world that saw it only as a commodity. The roof of the cottage groaned, then collapsed inward with a great, whooshing roar, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the night sky. The structure was now a hollowed-out, glowing skeleton, a brilliant, terrible beacon in the darkness. Jacob sat on the bench, the cold of the wood seeping into his bones, the heat of the fire warming his face. He did not move. He did not cry. He simply watched, a silent, solitary priest presiding over the cremation of his own life. He was the keeper of the flame, the guardian of the ashes. He had lost his home, but he had saved its soul, and in the flickering, destructive light of the fire, he felt a strange and terrible sense of peace. The wail of sirens began as a faint, distant cry, a mournful sound that sliced through the pre-dawn stillness. Jacob remained on the bench, his gaze fixed on the glowing, skeletal remains of his home. He had been sitting there for hours, a silent vigil, as the fire consumed his past. The initial roaring inferno had died down, leaving behind a pulsating orange heart of embers that glowed and breathed in the darkness. The first fire truck lumbered down the narrow gravel road, its red lights flashing, painting the surrounding trees in frantic, strobing patterns. It was followed by another, and then a sheriff's car. Men in heavy coats and helmets spilled out, their movements urgent and professional. They found Jacob sitting on the bench, a lone, still figure in the chaotic scene. A young, fresh-faced firefighter rushed over to him, his face etched with concern. "Sir, are you all right? Were you in the house?" Jacob looked up at him, his expression calm, his eyes reflecting the dying glow of the fire. "No, son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I was already out. I couldn't sleep." "What happened?" the firefighter asked, his gaze shifting from Jacob to the smoldering ruins. "The fireplace," Jacob said, the lie coming easily, practiced and smooth. "It's an old house. The flue. It's always been tricky. I put a log on before I went to bed to keep the chill off. I must have not closed the screen properly. I woke up to the smell of smoke. By the time I got out, it was already too late." He delivered the lines perfectly, his voice laced with a believable mixture of shock and grief. He looked like what they expected to see. A heartbroken, elderly man who had just lost everything in a tragic accident. The fire chief, a burly, mustached man named Henderson, came over. He listened to Jacob's story, his expression sympathetic. "It happened, sir," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Old wiring, old chimneys. These old cottages can go up like a tinder box. The important thing is that you got out safely." He looked at the metal toolbox sitting beside Jacob. "Is that all you managed to save?" Jacob nodded, clutching the handle of the box. Just a few things," he murmured. "Things my wife, things she held dear." "We need to notify your next of kin," Chief Henderson said gently. "Is there someone we can call?" Jacob gave him Mark's number. He watched as the chief walked away, speaking into his radio. The call was being made. The final act of the drama was about to begin. As the firefighters doused the last of the embers, sending great plumes of steam and smoke into the pale dawn sky, Mark's car came screeching down the road. He slammed on the brakes, his expensive sedan skidding to a halt on the gravel. He burst out of the car, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He stared at the blackened, smoking shell of the cottage, at the place that had been, just yesterday, a prime piece of lakefront real estate. His first words were not for his father. They were not words of concern or relief that Jacob was safe. "What happened?" he yelled, his voice cracking with fury. "What did you do?" He strode over to Jacob, his eyes wild, his fists clenched. "The house. It's gone. Do you have any idea how much money we just lost?" Jacob looked up at his son, at this man who was mourning the loss of a commission, not the loss of a home. He felt nothing. The anger, the grief, the disappointment, it had all been burned away in the fire. He was hollowed out, empty, and, strangely, peacefully, calm. "It was an accident, Mark," he said, his voice flat. "The fireplace." "An accident?" Mark shrieked, his voice attracting the attention of the firefighters. "An accident doesn't burn a $500,000 property to the ground. You were careless. You were negligent. I told you this place was a death trap." Chief Henderson stepped between them. "Sir," he said, addressing Mark firmly, "your father is in shock. This was a tragic accident. We see it all the time. Now, I need you to calm down." But Mark was beyond reason. He was a man watching his financial salvation turn to ash before his very eyes. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, muttering about insurance, about market value, about his own ruined plans. It was then that one of the younger firefighters, who'd been carefully sifting through the debris near the fireplace, called out, "Chief, look at this." He walked over, carrying something in his gloved hands. It was a large, rectangular object, blackened and charred around the edges, its leather cover blistered and peeling from the intense heat. But it was, miraculously, intact. It was the photo album. The firefighter handed it to Chief Henderson, who in turn passed it to Jacob. "Sir," he said, his voice full of a quiet awe, "it looks like this was right by the hearth. The stone must have protected it from the worst of the flames. It's incredible that it survived." Jacob took the album. It was warm to the touch. He held it in his lap, his gnarled fingers tracing the outline of the bubbled, heat-warped leather. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew what was inside. Mark stopped his frantic pacing and stared at the album in his father's hands. He looked at the smoldering ruins, at the firefighters packing up their hoses, at the cold, gray light of the morning, and in his eyes, for the first time, a flicker of something other than anger appeared, a flicker of confusion, a dawning, unsettling suspicion. He looked at his father, at the old man sitting so calmly amidst the wreckage, clutching a single, scorched book. He looked at the toolbox by his father's feet. He looked at the placid, almost peaceful expression on his father's face, and he began to understand that this was no accident. This was a message. This was an act of defiance. This was the last, desperate, and triumphant act of a man who had chosen to burn his kingdom to the ground rather than surrender it to an unworthy heir. The sun was higher now, a pale, watery disk in the smoke-hazed sky. The firefighters had finished their work, leaving behind a scene of quiet, desolate ruin. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and charred wood. Mark stood amidst the wreckage, his earlier, frantic rage having subsided into a sullen, simmering resentment. He kept staring at the blackened footprint where the cottage had once stood, his mind endlessly calculating the financial loss. Jacob remained on the bench by the lake, the scorched photo album resting in his lap. He had not moved. He was a statue of quiet contemplation, a stark contrast to his son's restless, agitated energy. Finally, Mark seemed to run out of steam. He walked over to the bench and sank down beside his father, letting out a long, defeated sigh. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a weary, bitter sense of loss. "The insurance," he said, his voice flat. "I called them. The policy hadn't been updated in 30 years. It'll cover the land value, maybe. But the structure, it's a total loss. We've lost hundreds of thousands of dollars." Jacob did not respond. He continued to stare out at the lake, his fingers gently tracing the warped, bubbled leather of the album. "Why, Dad," Mark asked, his voice a low, raw whisper, "why would you do this? Was it to punish me?" Jacob turned his head slowly and looked at his son. He saw not a successful, middle-aged man, but a lost, angry boy, a boy who had never learned to value anything he couldn't buy. "Punish you?" Jacob said, his voice soft. "No, Mark, this was never about you." "Then what was it about?" Mark demanded, a flash of his earlier anger returning. "You destroyed everything, our history, our memories." "Did I?" Jacob asked quietly. "I thought that's what you wanted to do. You wanted to sell our history. You wanted to put a price tag on our memories. I simply took them off the market." He opened the photo album. The pages were stiff and brittle, the edges browned and curled from the heat. But the photographs themselves, protected by the thick pages and the heavy leather cover, were mostly unharmed. He turned to the first page. A black and white photograph of a young, smiling couple, standing proudly in front of a half-finished wooden frame. Jacob and Evelyn, their faces full of hope and determination. "You talk about money, Mark," Jacob said, his voice a low murmur. "You see a financial loss. But look here." He tapped the photograph with a trembling finger. "Do you see a market value? I see the beginning of our family. I see your mother, pregnant with you, her hands on her belly, dreaming of the life we were going to build." He turned the page. A picture of a small boy with a gap-toothed grin holding up a tiny fish. "I see a summer afternoon. I see your first fish. I see the look of pure, unadulterated joy on your face." He turned another page. A family portrait taken by the fireplace. A teenage Mark, looking awkward and sullen. Evelyn, her arm around him, her smile full of a love that was both fierce and patient. Jacob, standing behind them, his hand on his son's shoulder. "I see a family," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "Flawed, yes. Complicated. But a family. This is what you wanted to sell to strangers. You wanted to let them walk through these rooms, paint over these memories, build their own lives on the ashes of ours." He looked at his son, his eyes clear and steady. "I couldn't let that happen, Mark. This house, it was your mother's heart. It was my life's work. It was not for sale, not at any price." He closed the album and held it out to his son. "You wanted to sell the cottage," he said. "Well, it's gone. There's nothing left to sell. But this is your inheritance." Mark stared at the scorched, battered book as if it were a venomous snake. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, his voice full of a bitter confusion. "I can't pay my mortgage with old photographs." "No," Jacob agreed. "You can't. But maybe, if you look at them long enough, you might remember what's actually important. You might remember your mother's smile. You might remember what it felt like to be happy here, before the world taught you that everything has a price." He pushed the album into his son's hands. "This is all that's left, Mark. The stories, the memories, they're yours now. Do with them what you will." Mark took the album, its weight a strange, unfamiliar burden in his hands. He looked from the book to the smoking ruins, then back to his father's calm, resolute face. He opened his mouth to say something, to argue, to protest, but no words came. His world of numbers and deals and market values had no language for this. He stood up, clutching the album to his chest like a shield. He looked at his father one last time, his expression a maelstrom of anger, confusion, and a tiny, flickering spark of something that might have been shame. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. He drove away, leaving Jacob alone on the bench, with the ruins of his past behind him and the quiet, placid lake before him. He had given his son the only inheritance that mattered. Whether Mark would ever understand its true value was no longer his concern. In the weeks that followed the fire, Jacob moved into a small, clean, and utterly anonymous apartment in a quiet, residential part of the city. It was a place with no history, no ghosts, no memories. The walls were a neutral beige, the carpets a sensible gray. It was the kind of place Mark had probably envisioned for him, a neat, manageable box for his final years. But Jacob did not feel like he was in a box. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, utterly and completely free. He had almost nothing. The few precious items from the metal toolbox sat on his new, simple nightstand. His father's watch, Evelyn's ring, the framed photograph of her beautiful, smiling face. These, he realized, were all he had ever truly needed. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the accumulated clutter of a lifetime, had been just that, clutter. He had his pension, a modest but sufficient income that covered his rent and his simple needs. He spent his days rediscovering the city he had long ignored. He walked in the park. He visited the library. He sat in small cafes watching the world go by. He was no longer the custodian of a house, the guardian of a past. He was just a man living in the present. He did not hear from Mark. He had not expected to. He had given his son the photo album, the chronicle of a life he had rejected. The next move, if there was to be one, was his. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a month after the fire, Jacob was sitting on a park bench, reading the newspaper, when he saw a familiar figure walking towards him. It was Mark. He was not wearing a suit. He was dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, and he looked tired, older, and somehow smaller. He stopped in front of the bench, his hands in his pockets, his gaze uncertain. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet. "Mark," Jacob replied, folding his newspaper. He did not invite his son to sit. He simply waited. I've been looking at the album," Mark said, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over his father's shoulder. "Every night." Jacob remained silent. "I'd forgotten," Mark continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I'd forgotten what her smile looked like. I'd forgotten what I looked like when I was a kid. Happy." He finally met his father's gaze. "I went to see a lawyer," he said, "about the insurance money. He said there's nothing I can do. It's all yours. The land, the payout, everything." "I know," Jacob said simply. "I don't want it," Mark said, the words coming out in a rush. "The money, I don't want it. It's yours. It was always yours." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the scorched, battered photo album. He held it out to his father. "This, though," he said, his voice cracking. "This is what I want. If you'll let me keep it." Jacob looked at the album in his son's outstretched hands. He looked at his son's face, at the genuine, painful remorse in his eyes. He saw, for the first time in years, a flicker of the boy he had raised, the boy who had gotten lost in a world of ambition and greed. He did not take the album. "It's already yours, Mark," he said softly. "It always was. That was your inheritance." He stood up from the bench. "I have to go," he said. "I'm meeting a friend for coffee." He began to walk away, leaving his son standing there clutching the tattered remnants of his own history. "Dad," Mark called out after him. Jacob stopped, but did not turn around. Will I see you again?" Jacob thought for a long moment. He thought of the fire, of the ashes, of the long, painful journey he had taken to reclaim his own soul. He thought of Evelyn, and what she would have wanted. "I don't know, son," he said, his voice carrying on the autumn breeze. "That's up to you. You know where I live." He continued walking, leaving Mark alone in the park with the ghosts of his past. He did not know if his son would ever truly understand, if he would ever be able to rebuild himself from the ashes of his own making. But for the first time, Jacob realized that it was no longer his burden to bear. He had saved his home from the indignity of a sale. He had protected his wife's memory. He had given his son the only thing of value that remained. He had turned his past into ash and memory, leaving behind a legacy not of property or money, but of a love that was fierce enough to burn the world down to protect itself. And in that, in the quiet, solitary freedom of his new life, he had found his final, bittersweet, and undeniable victory.